life, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are innocent or guilty. It just means you get the benefit of the doubt. Where a black person is more of a fear factor. So when you deal with the police or when you are in a job interview, it's just certain things that you get the benefit of the doubt that a black person might not get the benefit of the doubt.
As a black man, if you get arrested, you know, you got to put your hands on the steering wheel. As if a white person got arrested, you know, they can go in the glove box and grab, you know, the insurance, the certificate of the, you know, the vehicle or whatever. Where if you're black, you know, you grab that, they think you got a gun, or they already assume that you have a weapon in your hand. And at that point, you either dead or you going to jail at that point.
Just recently, I had to tell my son, who was an 8th grader going to school in Menominee Falls, that he can't play ding-dong ditch with his friend, his classmate who was white in Menominee Falls and think it's okay. And it hurt me to have to tell him that, because I wish by this time we wouldn't be having that conversation, but it's still there.
I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. These are words that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, spoke 2,000 years ago in a very dramatic and traumatic time, right before Jesus went to the cross to truly unify the human race, unified in the reality that we live as sinners, needing a Savior. Words that he said right before he went to the cross to make those who trust in him saved. My name is Mike Westendorf. I'm the host of this Mile Markers segment. In light of the history, and quite frankly, in light of the silence that we have often had in religious settings and circles, we want to talk about the racial inequality, the tension that exists in our culture that has always been here. But we want to be able to speak into it from a Christian perspective. And I know that not everybody watching this is coming from a Christian space, but we want to be able to bring the heart of God here. And the heart in which we talk about the culture of this conversation that we would like to be able to have is in a couple of places. Also in the book of John, which is where all of these passages came from, is Jesus talking to his followers, his intimate group of disciples, when he says this, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another." And another place that you'll see in Ephesians and in many places in the Bible, submit to one another. And those of you who are followers of the Time of Grace ministry, you've heard Mike Novotny talk about that idea of submit, meaning you first. This is the culture that we want to be able to breathe into this conversation. And so we are honored to be able to have an awesome group of people who are here today. And I'd like to be able to start with Pastor Aaron Robinson, give you guys all an opportunity to just take a little bit to introduce yourself, where you're from. Yeah, I'm even going to ask how old you are. Just give us a little bit of info on yourself, and then we'll kind of dive into our conversation for today.
My name is Aaron Robinson. I serve as a pastor at Fairview Lutheran Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Served in New York for 3 years, and then the high school ministry at both St. Croix and Wisco, respectively. And I'm here to talk about the things that are on our minds right now. I'd happen to be 4 years less than 50.
Sweet. That's me too, man. I appreciate the way that you said that. Although you did say 50, so I'm not sure if I feel like that or not.
My name is Janai. I am 22 years old from Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I'm a recent graduate from St. Norbert College with a thank you.
Congratulations.
With a psychology degree. And I'm hoping to go to Laos to teach English as a second language in the high schools, and then also to reach the Hmong people in the villages and the mountains, and also share the gospel and work in ministry there for hopefully a year or two before going back to school.
Awesome.
I'm Michael. I'm 20 years old. I work a lot. I graduated from Pius XI 2 years ago. Things I do in the free time is Fortnite, play basketball, and sleep a lot.
Although you get up early, man.
Yeah, 4 a.m.
Yeah, I mean, so when he says he's working, I mean, that's working. That's working.
That's awesome. I'm Sydney Giovinazzo. I've gotten to serve at Kingdom Prep Lutheran High School for the past about 5 years now, both as a teacher and now this coming year as a director of the internship program, where we get to watch our 60 junior boys start to step into their purpose in post-secondary life, finding what is God's purpose for their life and work, and then getting to watch them just grow in that. And so I'm excited to be here today, mostly to just listen and to learn from people who are a lot smarter than me and have had more experiences than I. So thanks
Awesome.
for having me here.
I am C.L. Whiteside. I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Garden Homes for grade school and then Wisco for high school. And right now I serve as the assistant principal at Wisconsin Lutheran High School. Stevens Point is the college that I went to. I think the only places I live besides Milwaukee, I would say, would be Stevens Point and then the Hamptons in New York.
And how old are you guys?
I'm 32.
Oh, sorry, I'm 26.
I'm 46. Same with Aaron before. Grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for myself, for the most part. A year and a half in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Also a place that has a history. And then 4 years in the Twin Cities as well. I lived for about 4 years in the Eden Prairie area in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we are talking about we wanted to talk about a lot of the things that we're not hearing, or that oftentimes get blown through in terms of media, or because it's being reported in the media, people will just write it off, altogether. And so, this is a real conversation. We've talked a little bit off camera as well that my disposition, maybe it's the time of life I don't know, but if there's an elephant in the room, let's just talk about it. Could we talk about it, please, so that we can do something about it right or well? And so to get our conversation, we don't know exactly how all of this will go. I've got a few things that we'll use for some direction, but I would like to just start out with one of the things that I think early on I didn't understand why this was a big deal, but it is a major talking point today. And that is Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. I would like to, first of all, just talk about what is Black Lives Matter? What is it when that t-shirt is worn or that postcard or poster is held up? What does that really mean? And I'm wondering if you guys can kind of help us understand that.
There is a frustration that comes to me when I hear all lives matter in this context. Because as an African American, as a black man, America has often done whatever it could to diminish the difference or the perceived difference between black Americans and white America, or even other minorities. And it happens even in our church body. I'll tell you a story about at a conference I went to years back. They had all the different missions, like Latino mission and the Hispanic mission or the Hmong mission. They had all these listed in a folder, and there was no African American or black mission. They had just put it in with America. And I can understand why they would want to do that, because there's no language difference, but there's still a cultural difference that can be addressed in literature, ads, conversation pieces. And so the church does it. I think society does it. It's, that they should be used to it. They've been here as long as anybody. And yet, to be distinct and unique and different and given that space, it doesn't happen a whole lot. And so when you have a black person killed, to say Black Lives Matter, you're talking about that person. And when we get arrested on every news channel, it says black man. So why not give us that when we get killed? And so don't take that moment of grief away and put it into the bigger pool, where there are problems in the bigger pool too. I get that, but this is specific to at the rate of which is happening to a group that is percentage-wise that much smaller in America. So that's why I would never encourage someone to say all lives matter in this context. In 5 months, when this is not the big thing, yes, all lives matter. Do something with that and help everybody get where they need to go. But when we're talking about George Floyd or Aubrey's death, and let's not diminish that or try to placate.
Yeah. I'm going to keep walking us down from the age group. So 46 to 32. So I'm going to come to you too. I want you to have just to help us.
I think it's just kind of Captain Obvious that all lives matter. When people say Black lives, it's really like Black lives matter too. There's obviously an issue in the Black community with Black men or Black people getting killed and getting treated unjustly. So when someone says Black lives matter, it's more like Black lives matter too. It's obvious that a white person's life matters. It's obvious that an Asian person's life matters. It's just kind of one of those things where I look at it like if my arm was broken, I wouldn't necessarily cast the whole body and say, my legs matter too. Right now, the arm is broken, so I need to focus and fix that first. So that's when I look at Black Lives Matter. And I think sometimes, especially like with the church and school, we get confused with the organization versus the movement. And a lot of times, especially I know when my students and when kids are talking about, they're talking about this movement, and they're talking about, all right, Black Lives Matter, and we need to focus on that. Okay.
That's hugely helpful, that idea of, if my arm is broken, I don't talk about my legs. That's huge. Michael, for you?
So yeah, same. So with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's just a big difference between that and all lives matter, because as a black man, if you get arrested, you got to put your hands on the steering wheel as if a white person got arrested, or if a Mexican got arrested, they can go in the glove box and grab, the insurance, the certificate of the, the vehicle or whatever, where if you're black, you grab that, they think you got a gun, or they already assume that you have a weapon in your hand. And at that point, you either dead or you going to jail at that point. So that's where Black Lives Matter and all lives matter is just a huge difference. All lives matter people, they don't get treated how black people get treated. There's just a huge difference in that. So that's my take on why I don't understand all lives matter, because it's just generic, because we already know all lives matter, but how about black people? Do our lives matter? So that's where I take from it.
Okay. I don't know if I don't want this to be overkill, but all lives matter is painful for people. You speak into the pain of what when you hear that in this context, within this context, when you hear all lives matter and people react in frustration and anger, what is the pain that they are expressing? You guys have given me the high. Now make this personal. What's the pain when you hear that?
It's the lack of recognition that something tragic just happened to a specific individual, and that we don't want to address that specific problem. And so we brought it out to the global problem. And there are problems within systems within our country that negatively affect black people more than others. And to not allow us as a nation to address it that specifically means that it probably won't ever get addressed like it needs to be, because it won't focus on the problem. And so for me, when I don't get angry about it, frustrated, disappointed, but I can understand the anger because it's being dismissed again. So today, I'll tell you this, I'll share this with you guys, is my 20th anniversary with my wife.
Yes.
And I will tell you this also, as a brother in Christ, I love y'all. If I say that same kind of thing to my wife, and she'd be like, what about me? I'm specifically your wife. That matters more than me loving y'all. I love her. And I don't get to say on my anniversary, I love you, honey, and everyone else. And so when we have a tragedy that happens to black people, I don't want to talk about Black Lives Matter and everyone else. I got to focus on the thing that is the issue in that moment. And when we don't do that, it makes us as black people feel like they really don't have a concern about our problem. And that's where I think the frustration and anger comes from. Not with my wife. I think we're good. I just say I think we're good.
Good. Add to that?
Yeah, I don't get like angry when I see All Lives Matter, but it's just the point that, you know, the media really has like a toll on this because, you know, they'll say an unarmed black man got killed, but, you know, they'll try to say some type of, you know, he might have had a gun, he might have had COVID-19, he might have health issues. So what they do is, you know, they try to like justify of what happened and, you know, act like, you know, shooting a black man isn't an issue. So so I don't see it as pain. I just see it more as, okay, you trying to justify why you just killed a black man for no reason.
So the All Lives Matter can be used to justify.
Right. It's more of to me, a justified movement of, you know, what I just said, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
For me, it's just you're missing the point. And a lot of times it just shows me sometimes that a person is selfish because we can't get outside ourselves at times. And it's just more so like you completely missed the point. It went over your head. We got to have a specific focus in order to fix a specific problem.
Yeah. As you guys were talking, I was just thinking about that idea that, you know, if you have clear water and you drop a dye in there, you know, blue or black or, you know, red, whatever, and you drop it in there and you can see it against a clear, you can see it clear, but you shake it up after a while and it's just all that muted color and you don't see the lines and you don't see its development, you don't see it processed. That when we mix the two, we're distilling, we're just smoothing it out and then all of a sudden we can hide behind justification. I want to hit another part of this from a couple of different angles, and because you talked about you're not paying attention. White privilege. This is something that when I first heard it, it was proposed within, I think it was in a media context, so it was, you know, ratcheted up already, and so it came off very strong, and so being a white guy who you know, I shopped I can remember as a kid going down the supermarket, those of us who can remember the days when the black and white generic aisle with the boxes, like bags of generic cheese puffs, they came in a black and white bag and black and white cereal. You know, so we didn't come from money, you know, but so as a white guy, I was offended at first. But then I started hearing more people talk about this idea within a way that I could understand it. And then probably the biggest one, and maybe I shouldn't go here, but I will, just because I think it put part of its finger on this, is the Drew Brees comment. You just don't, you're totally missing a conversation here. So I would like to just get your sense on, you know, help me understand white privilege and you know, Janai, from the Hmong perspective, you guys are, again, in a minority people group, but when you hear white privilege, what does that mean? I'd like to hear it from you guys first. Whoever would like to go.
I think when I hear that term, I just think of, you know, they kind of sort of get away with everything compared to like other race. You know, if a white person do this, you know, it takes, you know, years just for them to get arrested just for killing somebody, you know. That's what I think of white privilege. And also that, you know, white people tend to stand as one with each other compared to like black people, you know, like he said, we only come together when it's a tragic or something. So, you know, they tend to stick to white privilege. So it's more of a group thing to me.
Okay.
I say benefit of the doubt. And what I mean by that is just if you get pulled over and you happen to be white, it's a better chance that you are probably going somewhere productive and you are doing something positive with your life. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are innocent or guilty. It just means you get the benefit of the doubt. Or a black person, it's more of a fear factor. So when you deal with the police or when you are in a job interview, it's just certain things that you get the benefit of the doubt that a black person might not get the benefit of the doubt for white privilege.
Okay.
So I'm a little bit more underlying of the issue, I think, than my brothers here. Is it goes way back to having a larger cushion, a bigger net to fall back on when things go bad. And so we talk about the housing discrimination, talk about job discrimination. White privilege undergirds all that, because then you have privileges or an easier route to something because of not standing out due to the amount of melanin in your skin. Because there was a time way back when where even Europeans didn't get along and they fought between the different immigrant groups. But they could come together and then be called white as a whole group. And then all of a sudden, if you could fit into that category, then the loans came better, the housing, the way they treat you when you get pulled over. All that is part of the American system that we have not really addressed. That's something about. So to me, it's not so much a specific thing, but it's an underlying issue that I'm kind of conscious of every day of my life, that how I move and walk. Especially when I was in high school and college at predominantly white institutions, I couldn't move the same way exactly as my classmates did, for fear that if I did what they did, the repercussions would be harsher. And that was always in the back of my mind, even though I was still a teenager and did foolish things. I was always conscious of that fact. And just recently, I had to tell my son, who was an 8th grader going to school in Menominee Falls, that he can't play ding-dong ditch with his friend, his classmate who was white in Menominee Falls and think it's okay. And it hurt me to have to tell him that, because I wish by this time we wouldn't be having that conversation, but it's still there. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, that's real. You have to move different. That is a great way to put it.
Okay.
On the topic of what you said, it's easier, right? It's an easier route. When I think of white privilege, I think specifically of an article I read on privilege, right? I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what privilege is. And so when we hear people say, well, you have white privilege, or there is white privilege, a lot of people tend to think that we are not acknowledging their hard work or the things that they've gone through that makes their life difficult. And when I think of privilege, I like to explain it as like, well, I'm privileged as an able-bodied person. I don't have to worry if the restaurants I go to will have a wheelchair entrance, and that is a privilege, something I was born with and was given to me, nothing that I worked for, And so when I think of white privilege, what was it? It was said that white privilege is like, or any privilege is like running with the wind to your from behind you, right? The wind supports you when you're running. It doesn't make it any harder, but you don't always notice it and you don't always see it. Whereas like if you don't have the privilege, let's say in this case, if you are a black person rather than a white person, it's more like running against the wind. It makes running a lot harder than if you are a white individual running with the wind than against it. So that's what I think of when I think of white privilege, or just privilege in general.
Let me follow up on that just a little bit and say, now in this conversation, you brought up white privilege, which is a wonderful conversational point. What I don't want to have happen with those who are watching it is say, what about affirmative action? Mm-hmm. Now you're changing the topic again, and you are moving the point. Instead of saying this was the conversational piece that focused on white privilege, we could have a whole other conversation about how affirmative action came about, the good and bad of it. But that's not the same as talking about a system that has the wind at your back if you're white, and for others, it seems to be running into the wind.
Yeah.
I think you made an interesting point where you said when you first heard that, you came across as very defensive, which I think naturally for anybody who is of white privilege is going to. And I think it's important that we, coming from a white community, it's not our job to get defensive with that. And I find it interesting that so often we do, and I think it goes back to what you mentioned about just being selfish. Like, we go back to, well, I didn't do anything wrong. You're right. Like, we didn't necessarily do anything wrong, per se, as white individuals in our current society. However, like, I think that invites us into a deeper need to then listen and to say, okay, that is the reality. White privilege is a reality, whether or not you want to or don't want to get defensive. It is a reality. And so I think that invites us into a deeper need to then, okay, what does that mean for me as an individual now? What is my role and responsibility in this society? And then who can I like listen to more so that I can better understand what that means for me and what that means for you. Does that make sense? It's just so interesting that we as white people get very defensive on that. It's like, it's not about us. So stop getting defensive, accept it as a reality, and then let's move forward understanding how that, like, what our role is in our current community.
When you two first heard white privilege, did you hear us saying that you're not working hard? Or you didn't have it hard at times? Or what did you hear when you heard white privilege at first?
It was almost like, how dare you say that I've come from privilege as almost as if it's a bad thing, right? And I think I grew up thinking that growing up in privilege is then you're saying that that is a bad thing. And so it was hard. It felt like I was being blamed for something that I didn't even do, instead of recognizing that it's not about that. Like, it's not like you're blaming me for something, right? It's just the reality of that.
I heard, thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
You make it a safe place to say some of the things that we know need to be said. I heard, you owe me. When I first heard that, I heard, you owe me. You know, and I'm thinking, okay, well, that makes me afraid, you know, because then I can stand and say, you know, I have had, if I sit back and I acknowledge that, I like, the wind analogy is so helpful. I think that that's just, because you don't even know it's there. Yeah, you're right. When you're running with the wind,
you don't know.
Unless you've ever run against the wind, you wouldn't recognize the help that you're getting. And even systemically, the banding together, which we'll talk community in a little bit, but yeah, I heard you owe me, and that made me afraid.
Yeah, because I've seen and noticed white people will bring up that, like, either I worked really, really hard to get there, or, you know, I had my own problems and I had my own shortcomings. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, that's very true, and I believe that you worked really, really hard, but you just have to realize a black person might be in the same situation, they have the same problems that you have, and then on top of that, times two, they have being black. And they have systemic racism and police brutality and all the other things that go along with that. So they have to work hard, and then on top of that, they have the issue of being black.
And that's what we'll never understand. And I have to look at my students often and say that to them. Like, I will never understand where you are coming from. I can listen, I can have compassion. I can't have the level of empathy that I wish I could. And I think that's where that ignorance and defensiveness comes from, is that we can't understand, right? And so that invites us into that responsibility to listen, because it's not that, like, we haven't worked hard enough, but, like, we can't understand the level of, like, struggle and oppression that plagues your community, right?
And what's so weird about this conversation is some of us may go through life and have very little of the negative that comes with that affect us. Depending on the place you're at, the parenting you have, the school you're at, the community you have. And so when we talk about this as a topic, realize that not every black person has had the same level of struggle as every black person even. Right. But that doesn't mean it's not in their mind. So just because I have not been arrested doesn't mean I don't fear that when I'm driving my daughter to New Ulm, Minnesota, and I'm going through a bunch of places that I'm the only black person in the county. I fear that, even though it hasn't happened. It's there. So that's even part of the issue that you can't account for with regard to white privilege, that thought process won't be there. And then I had this talking to my brother who keeps me It keeps me humble. I was wondering this question. For someone who came from the east side of Milwaukee and grew up in Milwaukee and got my education, got a degree, and have a wife and 5 kids and somewhat successful in life, have I not done enough to take down the racism mountain? That have I avoided the mountain of racism, avoided the conflicts, and got around it, and am I complicit in this moment? And I had that struggle during this conversational piece for me personally, is that could I have done more to build bridges across or to help, whatever else? And because it's not like every black person has had the universal struggle that could be there for any black person. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about individuals, the white person that said, I had a struggle, they may have had a harder struggle than a black person in life. Mm-hmm. But they've never had to do the moving about and this wondering if, and then the grieving for that has to happen. So it's not like I'm saying to an individual white person, you had it better than me, carte blanche, and because of our skin color. Right. Not the case. But there are things that I've had to work through that they haven't had to work through that will never, so that's. Yeah.
Yeah, jumping on that, I kind of wanted to just, I guess haven't really put out a definition for white privilege, and I just wanted to kind of make it clear, especially for the viewers, because some people just don't know. I think for my own personal definition of white privilege, I think of, like you had said, right? White people, yeah, there are a lot of white people who are in poverty and lives are hard. But what I've learned throughout my years is that your life is not made hard because of your skin color, and that's what white privilege is. And coming from an Asian community, I think that Asian people benefit from this white privilege as well, because we are not black, and we're considered the model minority. And so a lot of people tend to use Asians as kind of like, well, if the Asian community can get there and if they can, overcome this racism that's in the US, why can't black people? And so I definitely think that the Asian community benefits from this whiteness. I think that's something that a lot of people in the Hmong community I've seen don't want to address or talk about, and they don't want to become aware that we are benefiting from white privilege. And yeah, we're minority too, but we have never faced the same oppression or discrimination that the black community has faced. So
I appreciate the perspectives of all of this. I want to speak directly to, and I'm going to have you piggyback on this as a pastor, but I'm just being honest that when I first heard white privilege, my knee-jerk mind went to blessing. So we use our privilege, because we've been blessed. But if you're not careful, fellow Christians, we can make an assumption in our heart, it's very subtle, that says, I'm not privileged, I'm blessed. Ooh. And if you're not really careful, you will step right under the prosperity gospel, which says, if I do things God's way, I receive blessings. Therefore, you're in non-Christian territory as a Christian at that point. And I just wondered a little bit if you get that sense that, and again, I'm talking about the Christian community because we're all part of that Christian community. Is there something underneath that? Because that's where my heart initially went to when I was trying to defend privilege. It's not privilege, I've just been blessed. Oh, because I did it more God's way? Wait a second, Mike. Whoa. You've just stepped into a gospel that is no gospel. Right. And I just throw that out there for all of us to consider who call ourselves Christians, and just wondering if you have a thought on that.
Wow. Okay, so we talk about how God blesses us. Each of us can say that God has blessed us with family. And that's a way to use that term and understand that I've been blessed to have a mother and father who love me enough to bring me into this world and not abandon me or get rid of whatever else, however that happened in your life, right? So that's a blessing. But then to talk about it in the context of this white privilege conversation, now it's saying that I'm blessed more than them because of the tone of color of my skin again. And that becomes the issue with it. That you should thank God for your parents and say, God bless you with your parents who happen to be white. But that's not why you were blessed. It wasn't because they're white. It's because they cared for you and they loved you and they shared God's word with you. Mm-hmm. And so it's getting out of the concept of the race being part of that blessing. And I was walking around the campus earlier, and there's a picture outside. I took a picture of the show at CL earlier. There's Jesus holding a baby. Do you know the picture?
I'm not sure.
I'll share it with you later.
Yeah, okay.
The baby has the blondest hair in the world, has the whitest skin tone, and then the baby, Jesus has him cradled right here. Then standing there with food to give to Jesus, so serving, if you want to go racially on this, serving is it looks like a Native American dress, and another person with brown skin, that aren't being cradled. The white baby's being cradled. The other two aren't being cradled. And so sometimes in our church, we know Jesus was Jewish, but yet we still put up pictures of a very pale Jesus. And we still produce movies with a European-looking Jesus. That's part of the problem within the church. That even though we know better, we're still not doing better. And we could talk about it being traditional, and it's part of the tradition, and art is art, but then it makes me as a black man think that maybe we don't want to talk about the real Jesus who was brown and possibly even darker than most current day Israelites, because there was no AC back then. He was out walking in the sun. Right. But we don't do that. And so that's where I think the church struggles with that. So you are blessed, Mike. You were blessed to have parents who loved you, but it wasn't because they were white. Right. Another thing I don't like hearing is, well, good thing God had slavery happen, so we get all these black people Christian.
Oh yeah.
Once again, those two things are connected. God moves and works where we don't even know. And there were Christians in Africa before the slave trade. But yet, from here, at least in America, we have this Eurocentric view of Christianity that is hurtful to the church's perspective of the racial conflict within our nation. And part of what I hope we move away from is say, okay, let's get back to not a Eurocentric, but a biblical-centric view, and what it actually is, and who Jesus was, and who he came to die for. And that's the world. And it didn't have a color scheme to it. It didn't have an ethnicity to it. It was the world. And we're all part of that same world. So, I get why privilege and blessed would be an issue and confusion, but understand why you're blessed, and then what that means that for you going forward. But it's different than the privilege conversation.
Yeah. You amen that. This is the first time I heard you guys talk about Eurocentric Christianity. Yeah. I think you need to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's like a big turnoff with a lot of black people too, is that this white Jesus that gets portrayed, and that everything that is white is right, and that automatically creates a division with blacks and whites. And I think just looking at the simple facts, like he said, Jesus probably had brown skin. Jesus probably looked closer to one of us than to you in that regards. So I think it's just being real and being honest. And I think the church has kind of made a lot of mistakes with kind of becoming like Pharisees. I mean, even if you look at history, a lot of times you get to research and it says, like, I guess we can blame the Catholics for this though. They would say something like, came over here and tried to convert Native Americans, like forcing God on them, forcing Jesus on them. And that's not what Jesus would do at all. That's not loving at all. And I think sometimes people hold that against us as the church. And I think that's why the church, in a way, has to be one of the forefronters right here and actually speak against this stuff, where a lot of times we take a back seat when we really need to say something because we're part of the problem. We cause this issue as well.
I had a a sermon about how the Holy Spirit brings us into fellowship just last week. And I was excited about the possibility of seeing other Christians, other believers from the past in heaven when I get there with them someday. And then I had this thought that I didn't put it in the sermon because I didn't want to go down that road, but I wonder what those Christians who were part of the slave trade, the Jim Crow, the obvious, from our vantage point, obvious racism,
right,
would say about how they were living their faith in that moment. And that's a weird thought to have, because I still believe they're Christian. I still believe they believe in Christ as their Savior. Mm-hmm. Somehow, that whole love your neighbor and the Good Samaritan story missed them in applying it to everybody. Right. And that's part of Satan's trick. That's part of our own sinful nature. And I get that that's in the world. But that's one of those things like, wow, were they Christian? I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they were Christian, because I'm not going to judge hearts. I can't judge hearts. But it would make me, if I were not a person who himself had a foundation in Christ, question the entire Christian faith if those very people who said they were Christian were either okay with or were actually practicing slavery, or were okay with racism or practicing racism. So that's where we as a church need to be honest and say, there were moments in our history where people were not living out their faith the best they could, especially with regard to racism, about black people and white people conversation. And I think that becomes a really hard topic to discuss between cultures, because there's the question of, but I didn't do that. That was 4 generations ago. Right. I didn't do that. Well, but can we acknowledge that it happened and it was wrong and it was sinful and that Christ didn't approve of that, but we don't have that conversation. And I think as a nation we roundly condemn slavery, okay, but that wasn't the end of the problem. Mm-hmm. That was just part, maybe you want to say the beginning of the problem, but it's in America at least. But that's not the end of it, and we're still trying to figure out how we can get to an end to that. And it may never get there, right? Because we're in a sinful world. But let's just call it what it is. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, as you said earlier, right, and say, yes, there is racism. When I was a junior in college, our college chose to amalgamate with another college, right? And they were telling us at the pastoral training college about this, and I asked a question about how's that going to help our cross-cultural ministry? And the answer that I received from the stage was, we hadn't thought about that. Right. That hurts. Right. So we've got to be able to think about that, mm-hmm, and then talk about that, and then problem solve that. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we'll never truly become integrated churches racially, because we won't have the conversation. We'll get a black church and we'll have a white church. We'll have a sprinkle of blacks here, a sprinkle of whites there, and we'll throw in some other minorities. But we won't truly become this thing that we want to see on this side of heaven, because we won't have the conversation. We'll expect whoever's coming in that's the minority in that setting to conform to the majority way. And in our setting, it's becoming really evident that it's hard to do.
Right. We're going to, just because we've done enough of these mile marker videos to know that we're going to take a bit of a break, a pause break, to make a part 1 and a part 2, because the conversation that we want to have has a number more elements that we need to talk about. And so I know that for a lot of you watching, it's like, oh, I got to take a break. I got to take in what has just been said. And so, again, just a pause here for us. We're going to do a part 2 of this conversation, because we want to come back and we want to be able to talk about the notions of community. We need to talk about the reality of police relationships. And we need to, I would like to see us, if we couldn't maybe just finish on what are some things that we talk about as Christians within a church that believes in the gospel. What are some of the things that we can do right now? What's the moment that God is affording us by listening and by being humble? What's the moment that sits right before us that is ripe with possibility? to be able to bring the hope of this peace that Jesus talked about to a world that needs it so much. So we'll take a break here, but we'll be back with a second part coming up later.
On a journey, mile markers show your progress toward a destination. New places to see, new people to meet. And yet, adulting, it's exciting, and it's hard.
New experiences.
New fears to conquer.
New questions that need answers.
None of us get to the destination on our own. When that destination feels 1,000 miles away, you're not on that road alone.